The Terran delegation chamber hummed with anticipation, its polished steel walls reflecting the nervous energy of humanity's first formal diplomatic gathering with an alien species. Outside the viewing ports, Earth hung like a blue marble against the void. Beautiful, scarred, and utterly insignificant in the vast tapestry of galactic civilization. At least that's what the Zephyrians had told them. Ambassador David Cartwright adjusted his collar for the third time in 10 minutes, his weathered hands betraying a lifetime of conflict resolution in humanity's bloodiest century. The man had negotiated ceasefires in 3 different wars, had stared down dictators and warlords with equal measure of diplomacy and steel-eyed determination. Yet here, surrounded by technology that defied human understanding, he felt like a child playing at being important. "Sir," whispered his aide, Lieutenant Commander Jessica Park, "they're requesting our historical archives again. Cultural exchange protocols, they say." Cartwright nodded slowly. The Zephyrians had been insistent about understanding human civilization, our art, our music, our literature, and our wars. They seemed particularly fascinated by humanity's military history, though their questions carried an almost clinical detachment that made him uneasy. The massive chamber doors dilated with a soft hiss, revealing 3 figures that still made Cartwright's breath catch in his throat despite weeks of contact. The Zephyrians moved with an ethereal grace that seemed to mock gravity itself. Their leader, Cathara, stood nearly 8 feet tall, her translucent skin revealing a cardiovascular system that pulsed with bioluminescent fluid. Her 4 arms moved independently, each gesture precise and economical, while her large, dark eyes that held depths of intelligence and something else, something that might have been pity fixed upon the human delegation. "Ambassador Cartwright," Cathara's voice emerged from a series of harmonic tones that their translation devices rendered into perfect melodious English. "We are honored by your willingness to share your species' cultural heritage with the Galactic Confederation." Behind her, 2 other Zephyrians observed with scientific detachment. Morthek, the cultural analyst, had spent the past month cataloging human achievements with the enthusiasm of an entomologist discovering a new species of beetle. The third, Yuskaran, served as what humans might call a military historian, though the Zephyrians claimed to have abandoned warfare millennia ago. "The honor is ours," Cartwright replied, rising from his chair. "We've prepared a comprehensive overview of human civilization, as requested. Our achievements in science, the arts, exploration." He paused, noting how Yuzakaran's attention sharpened. "And our military heritage." "Ah, yes." Cortharar's melodic voice carried what might have been anticipation. "Your species' approach to conflict resolution. We find it unique among the 73 civilizations currently represented in the Confederation." The way she said unique sent a chill down Cartwright's spine. It wasn't admiration. It was the tone one might use when describing a particularly interesting bacterial culture. "If you're ready," said Park, gesturing toward the holographic display array, "we've prepared a chronological presentation, starting with early tribal conflicts and progressing through to the formation of the United Earth government." The lights dimmed. The first images materialized in 3-dimensional clarity. Ancient battlefields, siege engines, warriors locked in mortal combat. Cartwright watched the Zephyrians' faces carefully as humanity's bloodiest moments unfolded before them in vivid detail. "The Battle of Thermopylae," Park began, her voice taking on the cadence of a documentary narrator. 300 Spartan warriors against the entire Persian Empire. They knew they would die, but they fought anyway. Morthek's 4 arms began moving in complex patterns, his translation device working overtime to capture notes in the clicking, harmonic language of his people. "Fascinating. They chose certain death for what reason?" "Honor," Cartwright said simply. "Glory. The protection of their homeland." "Honor." Cathara repeated the word as if tasting something foreign and bitter. "Please, continue." The presentation moved forward through time's relentless march. Roman legions carving an empire from blood and ambition. Viking longships bringing terror to coastal settlements. Medieval knights charging into battle with religious fervor and dreams of eternal glory. With each passing century, Cartwright noticed a subtle change in the Zephyrians' demeanor. What had begun as clinical interest slowly transformed into something else. Their bioluminescent patterns shifted from the cool blues of curiosity to deeper, more agitated hues. The 100 Years' War, Park continued, her voice steady despite the mounting tension in the room, actually lasting 116 years. Generations born into conflict, knowing nothing but warfare. They celebrated this? Iskaran's question carried the first crack in the Zephyrians' composed facade. Some did, Cartwright admitted. War was seen as the ultimate test of human courage and ingenuity. The presentation reached the Renaissance, then the Industrial Age. Weapons grew deadlier, conflicts more savage. The American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War. The first glimpses of mechanized slaughter that would define the centuries to come. Then came the 20th century. The chamber fell silent as images of the Great War filled the space between them. Trenches stretching across scarred landscapes like infected wounds. Poison gas drifting over no man's land like the breath of death itself. Young men charging machine gun nests with nothing but bayonets and misguided bravado. 16 million dead, Park announced quietly. And when it was over, they called it the war to end all wars. Morthic's note-taking had ceased entirely. His forearms hung limply at his sides as if the weight of human violence had physically stunned him. But it didn't end war, Cartwright said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. 21 years later, we surpassed it. The Second World War unfolded in all its terrible majesty. Blitzkrieg tactics. The siege of Stalingrad. That day's blood-soaked beaches. Strategic bombing campaigns that turned entire cities into funeral pyres. The Holocaust's systematic horror. And finally, inevitably, the atomic flash over Hiroshima. 200,000 dead in an instant, Park said, her voice barely audible. The power of the sun brought to Earth. Kothara's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to deep purples and blacks, colors Cartwright had learned indicated severe distress in Zephyrian physiology. Well, you used weapons capable of annihilating your own species. We used them twice, Cartwright confirmed. The Cold War followed. Proxy conflicts across the globe. Nuclear stockpiles capable of ending human civilization a dozen times over. The Korean War, Vietnam, Afghanistan. A century of warfare that redefined the very concept of human conflict. But it was when they reached the recent past, the resource wars, the climate conflicts, the final desperate struggles that had nearly destroyed human civilization before the formation of the United Earth government, that something shifted in the Zephyrians' posture. Tell me, Corfira said, her voice taking on a quality Cartwright had never heard before. Something that might have been fear. When your warriors returned from these battles, how were they received? Cartwright exchanged glances with Park. The question was simple, but somehow loaded with implications he couldn't quite grasp. With honor, he said slowly. Parades. Medals. We built monuments to commemorate their sacrifices. And the battles themselves? How do your historical accounts portray them? Now Park stepped forward, her military background making her the natural choice to answer. With pride, mostly. We study tactics and strategy. We analyze what worked and what didn't. Military academies around the world require students to memorize famous battles. You study them, Iskarin's voice cracked. For what purpose? To get better at them, Park replied matter-of-factly. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like an eternity. The three Zephyrians communicated among themselves in rapid harmonic bursts that their translation devices couldn't parse fast enough to follow. Finally, Kothara spoke again, her voice carrying a tremor that made Cartwright's blood run cold. Ambassador, we must ask, in all these conflicts, in all these wars spanning millennia of your species' development, was there ever a time when your people fought reluctantly, out of necessity rather than what? Cartwright asked, though some part of him already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it spoken aloud. Rather than enthusiasm. The word hung in the air like a poison cloud. Cartwright felt his mouth go dry as the implications crashed over him. He thought of the cheering crowds sending soldiers off to war, the recruitment posters promising adventure and glory, the war songs, the battle hymns, the literature that glorified combat and conquest. Ambassador, Morthak said, his forearms trembling slightly. We must request clarification. When your species engage in warfare, do you enjoy it? Before Cartwright could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lights bathed the chamber in pulsing red as automated systems announced incoming priority transmissions from the Confederation Council. "What's happening?" Perk demanded, her hand instinctively moving to where her sidearm would be if this had been a human military installation. Cathara's patterns shifted to rapid, agitated displays of crimson and gold. "We must postpone this discussion, Ambassador. The Council requires immediate consultation regarding your species' application for Confederation membership." The three Zephyrians were already moving toward the exit, their graceful forms now carrying an urgency that bordered on panic. "Wait," Cartwright called after them. "When can we continue? We still have centuries of history to share." Cathara paused at the threshold, her dark eyes meeting his across the length of the chamber. When she spoke, her voice carried a finality that made his blood freeze. "I do not believe that will be necessary, Ambassador. I believe we have learned everything we need to know about humanity." The doors sealed shut with a definitive hiss, leaving the human delegation alone with their historical records and a growing sense that they had just failed a test they hadn't even known they were taking. Outside the viewing ports, Earth continued its eternal rotation, beautiful and blue and utterly unaware that its children might have just sealed their species' fate with nothing more than honest answers to simple questions. The first act of humanity's greatest trial had ended not with warfare or violence, but with the terrible realization that their greatest strength might also be their most damning weakness. And somewhere in the depths of space, the Galactic Confederation Council convened an emergency session to discuss what to do about a species that had just revealed itself to be the most dangerous form of life the galaxy had ever encountered. A civilization that loved war. The Confederation Council chamber existed in a state of controlled chaos that would have been impossible for human architects to conceive. Suspended in zero gravity within a crystalline sphere 3 kilometers in diameter, representatives from 73 different species floated in complex orbital patterns around a central forum, their individual atmospheric requirements maintained by personal environment fields that shimmered like soap bubbles in the ethereal light. Korvat drifted toward her species' designated position, her bioluminescent patterns still cycling through the deep purples and blacks of severe distress. Around her, the assembled representatives of galactic civilization maintained their own forms of agitation, the crystalline Vorthanani chiming in discordant harmonies, the gaseous Etherians swirling in tight, anxious spirals, the plant-like Sylvani rustling with leaves that had turned autumn shades of alarm. At the chamber's center, Arch-Mediator Nalthek of the ancient Precursor Council raised his 7 arms in the traditional gesture for convening. His species had achieved spaceflight while Earth was still cooling from its molten birth, and his voice carried the authority of eons when he spoke. "We gather in emergency session to address the cultural assessment of species designation, Homo sapiens, colloquially known as humans." His words echoed through the chamber in a dozen different translation matrices. "Cultural Analyst Morthek, of Zephyr Prime, present your findings." Morthek rose from his position, his 4 arms moving in the ritualistic patterns of formal address. His report would be broadcast simultaneously to every member world of the Confederation, reaching an audience of trillions across hundreds of star systems. "Honored Mediator, esteemed colleagues," he began, his melodic voice taking on the cadence reserved for the most serious of presentations. "I come before you with findings that challenge our fundamental understanding of civilized species development." A holographic display materialized in the chamber's center, showing the blue-green world that had spawned humanity. "The species under consideration originates from a planet they call Earth, a world that classification protocols identify as a Class 12 death world." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the assembly. Class 12 death worlds were considered uninhabitable by Confederation standards, too violent, too unstable, too inherently hostile to support complex civilization. "The gravity exceeds safe parameters by 37%, Morthek continued. "The atmospheric composition includes a corrosive oxidizing agent. The planet's surface is 71% covered by a solvent so aggressive that it dissolves most known materials. Weather patterns include electrical storms with the energy output of antimatter weapons, rotating atmospheric phenomena capable of leveling cities, and temperature variations that would prove lethal to most civilized species. The display shifted to show the scarred landscape of Earth, mountain ranges thrust up by tectonic violence, vast deserts scoured by winds that could strip flesh from bone, oceanic storms that dwarfed the largest spacecraft in the Confederation fleet. And yet, Morthek said, his voice taking on a note of amazement that bordered on horror, not only did complex life evolve on this world, it thrived. The humans are not the planet's apex predator. They are simply the most successful of dozens of species capable of killing them. Images flashed through the display: great white sharks, saltwater crocodiles, polar bears, venomous snakes, disease-carrying insects, predatory cats with claws like molecular blades. A catalog of evolutionary nightmares that would make Confederation biologists weep. The humans, Morthak continued, survived this crucible. More than survived, they conquered it. They eliminated or domesticated every creature that posed a threat to them. They reshaped the very landscape to serve their needs. And when they had conquered their world, the pause stretched for nearly 30 seconds as Morthek's patterns shifted through shades of disbelief. They turned on each other. The historical data began flowing through the chamber's displays, 10,000 years of human warfare compressed into digestible segments. The assembled representatives watched in growing horror as humanity's bloody march through history unfolded before them. We initially assumed, Morthak explained, that this was typical species behavior. Resource competition, territorial disputes, the normal growing pains of pre-spaceflight civilization. But as we analyzed their cultural records more deeply, we discovered something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of sapient behavior. The displays shifted to show human art, paintings of battles, sculptures of warriors, literature that glorified combat and conquest, music that stirred the blood and called forth images of glorious death, architecture designed to commemorate victory in war. They celebrate it, Morthek said, his voice barely audible. They don't fight out of necessity or desperation. They fight because some part of them enjoys it. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The Etherians began swirling in rapid, agitated patterns. The crystalline Vorthani produced a cacophony of discordant tones. The plant-like Sylvani rustled with leaves that had turned the deep brown of mortal terror. Impossible, declared Representative Yildar of the Harmonious Collective, his 6 mouths speaking in perfect unison. No civilized species could evolve such destructive impulses without destroying itself. And yet they nearly did, Morthek replied. Multiple times. Their most recent global conflict, what they call the Third World War, reduced their population by 40%. Cities burned for months. Entire regions became uninhabitable for decades. How did they survive? Asked the Etherian representative, her gaseous form swirling with confusion. They rebuilt, Morthak said simply. And they did it faster and more efficiently than any previous reconstruction effort in their history. War, it appears, drives their innovation. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The Confederation had built its peace on the principle that civilized species naturally evolved away from violence. Warfare was seen as a primitive phase that sapient beings outgrew as they developed higher reasoning and empathy. Show them the recruitment materials, Califra said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. New images appeared, human military recruitment posters spanning centuries of development. Join the army. See the world, adventure awaits. Be all you can be. Every poster promised excitement, glory, and the chance to prove oneself in combat. These are not conscription notices, Morthak explained. These are advertisements. They are voluntarily trying to convince their population to participate in warfare. Surely, interjected the representative of the peaceful Gardner worlds, these are aberrations, propaganda designed to manipulate their population during times of crisis. We thought so too, Kothara admitted, joining her colleague at the chamber's center, until we examined their entertainment media. The displays shifted again, showing humanity's fictional portrayals of warfare, movies, books, games, virtual reality experiences. Thousands of years of entertainment that glorified combat, celebrated warriors, and portrayed war as the ultimate test of human character. They create fictional conflicts for amusement, Yathara continued, her patterns now cycling through shades that the translation matrices struggled to interpret. They spend billions of their currency units producing elaborate fantasies about warfare. Their children play games that simulate combat. Their greatest heroes are warriors. But surely, pressed the Gardner representative, their philosophers, their intellectuals, their spiritual leaders condemn this violence? Morthek's response was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. Some do, but others developed entire philosophical frameworks to justify and even celebrate warfare. They speak of just wars and necessary conflicts. They quote ancient texts saying that war is the father of all things. They argue that conflict drives evolution, that struggle creates character, that peace makes civilizations weak and decadent. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives fled their positions, creating swirling patterns of confusion and panic. Emergency communication channels opened as delegates contacted their home worlds with news that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. Through it all, Archmediator Nelthak remained motionless at the chamber's center, his ancient eyes fixed on the images of human warfare that continued cycling through the displays. Finally, he raised his 7 arms for silence. "Cultural analyst Morthek," he said formally, "what is your recommendation regarding this species' application for Confederation membership?" Morthek's bioluminescent patterns dimmed to their lowest setting, the Zephyrian equivalent of hanging one's head in defeat. "Honored mediator, I cannot in good conscience recommend integration of a species that views warfare as an art form." And yet, Nelthak observed, they have achieved spaceflight. They have developed faster-than-light communication. Their technological advancement rate exceeds that of most Confederation species, which makes them more dangerous, not less. Cathara interjected. "A species that loves war and possesses advanced technology is not a candidate for peaceful coexistence. It's an existential threat." Around the chamber, the representatives were reaching the same conclusion. Humanity wasn't just another primitive species that needed time to mature. They were something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that had weaponized its own violent nature and turned it into a driver of progress. "There is another consideration," said Representative Zixtel of the Machine Intelligences, his synthesized voice cutting through the emotional chaos with digital precision. "Our preliminary scans indicate that human military technology has developed along significantly different vectors than our own." "Explain," Nelthak commanded. "They have not abandoned kinetic weapons in favor of energy-based systems. Their most powerful armaments still rely on accelerating matter to significant fractions of light speed. Their defensive systems are designed not to deflect or absorb energy, but to physically intercept incoming projectiles. Their tactical doctrines emphasize close-range engagement and what they term combined arms operations." The implications were staggering. Confederation military doctrine, such as it was, since warfare had been virtually eliminated for millennia, relied on sophisticated energy shields and directed energy weapons. Their ships and installations were designed to deflect coherent light and particle beams, not chunks of dense matter traveling at relativistic velocities. "They could hurt us?" someone whispered into the sudden silence. It wasn't a question. "Emergency protocols must be implemented," Nelthak declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "All contact with species designation Homo sapiens is hereby suspended pending full council deliberation, and if they attempt to establish contact on their own," asked the Etherian representative. The Archmediator's response would echo through Confederation space for generations to come, marking the moment when humanity's fate was sealed not by their failures, but by their greatest strength. "Then we must consider them a clear and present danger to galactic peace," he said, his words carrying the finality of a death sentence, "and respond accordingly." As the emergency session dissolved into chaos, with representatives fleeing to their ships and emergency broadcasts being transmitted to every corner of Confederation space, one final image lingered in the chamber's displays. It was a simple photograph from humanity's archives, a group of soldiers sitting around a campfire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames as they shared stories and laughter between battles. They looked tired, dirty, and utterly at peace with themselves and their place in the universe. They looked like people who had found their calling, and that more than any weapon or technology was what terrified the galaxy's peaceful civilizations more than anything else they had ever encountered. Humanity didn't just fight wars. They enjoyed them. And now, for the first time in galactic history, the Confederation was going to have to decide what to do about a species that might very well be better at warfare than anyone else in the galaxy. The second act had ended with a revelation that would reshape the cosmic order. Humanity wasn't seeking to join galactic civilization. Whether they knew it or not, they were preparing to conquer it. 3 months after the Emergency Confederation session, Ambassador David Cartwright stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of orbital station Prometheus, watching Earth's Terminator line crawl across familiar continents. Behind him, the station's command center hummed with barely controlled panic, as humanity's best and brightest struggled to comprehend the scope of the crisis that had engulfed them. "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Park approached with a datapad that seemed to weigh more than physics should allow. "We've lost contact with another deep space monitoring station. That's 7 installations in the past week." Cartwright didn't turn from the window. Couldn't turn, because in the reflection of the reinforced glass he could see the truth that everyone was trying so hard to avoid acknowledging. Earth was surrounded. "How many ships?" he asked quietly. "Conservative estimate? 1,500. Possibly more." Park's voice carried the controlled professionalism of a career military officer, but Cartwright could hear the tremor underneath. "They're maintaining position at the edge of our sensor range, but the gravity distortions are unmistakable." The largest fleet humanity had ever assembled consisted of 43 vessels, the pride of human engineering, armed with fusion weapons and kinetic bombardment systems that could crack continents, against 1,500 alien warships built by civilizations that had mastered faster-than-light travel while humans were still discovering fire. Any communication attempts, nothing direct. "But our xenolinguistics team has been monitoring Confederation channels." Hort paused, consulting her datapad. "They're calling it a quarantine protocol." Cartwright finally turned from the window, his weathered face grim. "They're not here to talk." On the command center's main display, General Patricia Harrison, the architect of humanity's victory in the resource wars and the closest thing Earth had to a strategic genius, was conducting a final briefing for the assembled fleet commanders. Her voice carried across the station with the kind of calm authority that had kept human civilization from destroying its darkest hour. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her iron-gray hair pulled back in the regulation style that had become her trademark. "We're facing a situation unlike anything in human history. We are outgunned, outnumbered, and operating with incomplete intelligence about enemy capabilities." The assembled officers, representatives of every Earth nation that had contributed ships to the hastily assembled defense fleet, listened with the kind of intense focus that only came when facing extinction. "However," Harrison continued, her lips curving into what might have been a smile, "we do have certain advantages that our opponents may not have considered." Admiral Chen Wang of the Asian Coalition raised his hand. "What advantages?" "General, their technology is centuries ahead of ours." "Their technology is centuries ahead of ours," Harrison agreed. "But when was the last time any of them fought a war?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to the universe itself. According to Confederation records, the most recent armed conflict between member species had occurred over 2,000 years ago. The galaxy's peaceful civilizations had forgotten something that humanity had never learned to forget: how to kill efficiently. "General Harrison," came a voice from the communication array, "we're receiving a transmission from the Confederation fleet. They're requesting immediate surrender of all human military assets and voluntary submission to quarantine protocols." Harrison's smile grew wider, and Cartwright felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the expression. He'd seen that look before, in the faces of human commanders who had been pushed beyond their breaking point and discovered something terrible and wonderful on the other side. "Signal the fleet," Harrison commanded. "All ships to combat stations. Launch fighters and prepare for engagement." "Ma'am," Park interjected. "They have over 1,500 ships." "They have 1,500 ships," Harrison corrected, "crewed by species that haven't fought a real war in over 2 millennia. We have 43 ships crewed by the descendants of the most violent species the galaxy has ever produced." She turned to face the assembled officers, and her next words would be carved into monuments across human space for generations to come. "They made one critical error in their intelligence gathering. They studied our history, our culture, our art and entertainment. But they missed the most important fact about humanity. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. We're not just good at war because we had to be. We're good at war because we wanted to be. The fleet engagement began 18 minutes later. Cartwright watched from Prometheus's command center as humanity's ships accelerated toward the Confederation fleet in a formation that General Harrison had privately called the Cavalry Charge. It was audacious, suicidal, and completely insane by any reasonable tactical standard. It was also pure humanity. The Confederation fleet, arranged in the careful geometric patterns that their military doctrine favored, opened fire at maximum range with coherent energy weapons that lit up space like a festival of deadly stars. Particle beams and plasma bursts lanced through the void with precision and power that should have vaporized the human ships instantly. Instead, the beams struck ablative armor that had been designed to withstand re-entry through Deathworld atmospheres and kinetic weapons that could punch through planetary crust. Hull plating that had been built to endure the gravitational stresses of Earth's volcanic regions absorbed energy bursts that would have crippled any other species' technology. They're built like bloody asteroids, someone whispered in amazement as the human ships continued their charge through a barrage that should have destroyed them. But Harrison's true genius revealed itself when the human fleet reached engagement range and opened fire with their own weapons. Kinetic bombardment systems designed for planetary assault launched projectiles the size of telephone poles at significant fractions of light speed. Fusion warheads that had been developed for asteroid mining created expanding spheres of nuclear fire. Railguns that had been intended for launching cargo into orbit instead launched depleted uranium slugs with the kinetic energy of falling meteors. The Confederation ships, with their elegant energy shields and advanced defensive systems, were helpless against attacks that relied on simple physics rather than sophisticated technology. Their shields, designed to deflect energy, were useless against chunks of matter traveling fast enough to achieve relativistic effects. Jesus Christ, Perk breathed as they watched a Confederation cruiser, a kilometer-long marvel of alien engineering, simply disintegrate under the impact of a human kinetic strike. They never considered that we might still be using bullets. The battle became a rout. Confederation ships, designed for warfare against opponents who fought with energy weapons and followed civilized rules of engagement, found themselves facing an enemy that had no such constraints. Human fighters strafed alien formations with weapons that should have been obsolete, while human capital ships closed to ranges that violating every principle of advanced space combat. And then General Harrison played her final card. All ships, her voice crackled across the communications array, execute ramming maneuvers. Cartwright felt his blood freeze. She's ordering them to ram the enemy ships, Park finished, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and admiration. She's turning our ships into guided missiles. One by one, human vessels that had been damaged beyond effective combat capability turned toward the largest Confederation ships and engaged their maximum acceleration. Fusion drives that had been built for interplanetary travel became the propulsion systems for weapons of mass destruction, traveling at significant fractions of light speed. The results were catastrophic. The first ramming attack, executed by the destroyer UES Indomitable under Captain Maria Santos, struck a Confederation battleship amid ships at 17% of light speed. The explosion could be seen from Earth's surface, a brief new star that appeared and vanished in the span of a heartbeat. When the plasma cleared, both ships had simply ceased to exist. "My God," someone whispered. "They're actually winning." The Confederation fleet, faced with an enemy that used weapons and tactics they hadn't encountered in over 2,000 years, began to break formation. Ships that had been designed for peaceful exploration and ceremonial display fled from opponents who treated warfare as both science and art. But Harrison wasn't finished. "Attention, Confederation fleet." Her voice broadcasted on all frequencies, carried by translation matrices to every ship in the enemy formation. "This is General Patricia Harrison of the United Earth Defense Force. You came here to quarantine humanity because you believe we're too violent for galactic civilization." A pause, filled with the static of dying ships and the screams of alien crew members who had never experienced the reality of human warfare. "You were right." The final phase of the battle lasted 7 minutes and 43 seconds. When it was over, fewer than 200 Confederation ships remained operational, and most of those were fleeing toward the edge of the solar system at maximum acceleration. Humanity had lost 31 of their 43 ships, and they had won. Cartwright stood in the aftermath, watching rescue shuttles recover survivors from the wreckage of human vessels, and tried to process what he had just witnessed. The most powerful military force in galactic history had been defeated by a species that was barely capable of interplanetary travel. "Sir," Park approached with another datapad, "we're receiving surrender requests from 17 different Confederation species. They're asking for terms." "Terms?" Apparently, Park's voice carried a note of disbelief that matched his own. "They want to know what humanity's demands are for ending hostilities." Cartwright looked out at the debris field that had once been the pride of galactic civilization, then at the battered human ships that continued to patrol the wreckage like predators guarding their kill. "What are our demands?" he asked quietly. General Harrison's voice came from behind him, carrying the weight of someone who had just reshaped the cosmic order with nothing but violence and determination. "Simple, Ambassador. We want them to remember this day." She moved to stand beside him at the window, her uniform torn and bloodied from the battle's command stress, her eyes bright with something that might have been triumph or might have been madness. "For 2,000 years the galaxy has enjoyed peace because everyone forgot how to fight. Today they remembered. Today they learned that somewhere in this universe there's a species that never forgot." "And what happens now?" Cartwright asked. Harrison's smile was sharp enough to cut vacuum. Now they get to live with the knowledge that humanity exists, that we're out here, that we're armed, dangerous, and perfectly willing to use violence to solve our problems." The communication array crackled to life with incoming transmissions from across Confederation space. Emergency sessions being called, peace negotiations being demanded, defensive alliances being proposed. "They're terrified," Park observed, monitoring the flood of alien communications. "Good," Harrison replied. "Fear breeds respect. Respect breeds peace. And peace—" She paused, watching Earth's Terminator line continue its eternal journey across the continents below. "Peace gives us time to build more ships." 3 hours later, Ambassador David Cartwright found himself in a position he had never expected to occupy, negotiating humanity's terms for joining galactic civilization from a position of strength rather than supplication. The Confederation's emergency negotiating team, led by a visibly shaken Kethara, had arrived under a flag of truce that carried more legal protections than any document in human history. "Ambassador," Kethara began, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors that suggested deep trauma, "the Confederation Council has authorized me to discuss terms for peaceful coexistence." "Coexistence," Cartwright repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting word choice. We may have misjudged humanity's intentions," the Zephyrian admitted. "Your defensive capabilities suggest that quarantine protocols were inappropriate." Cartwright leaned back in his chair, studying the alien delegation with eyes that had seen his species face extinction and emerge victorious. "What changed your mind?" Kuthara's patterns shifted to deep blues. What he had learned represented profound sadness. "We thought you were dangerous because you enjoyed war." "We were wrong, were we?" Cartwright asked mildly. "You are not dangerous because you enjoy war," she continued, her voice barely audible. "You are dangerous because you are exceptionally good at it. The enjoyment is merely a side effect of natural selection favoring combat effectiveness." The truth of it hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by spider silk. Humanity hadn't become violent by choice. They had become violent because their death world had demanded it. The species that survived Earth's crucible weren't the peaceful ones, or the clever ones, or the noble ones. They were the ones who could kill efficiently and sleep soundly afterward. "So what do you propose?" Cartwright asked. "Full Confederation membership," Kethara replied immediately. "With certain accommodations, such as humanity will be granted exclusive territorial rights to any system deemed unsuitable for colonization by other Confederation species. Worlds that are too violent, too dangerous, too hostile for civilized occupation." Cartwright raised an eyebrow. "You're offering us the death worlds." "We are offering you the worlds that only you could possibly want," she corrected. "In exchange, humanity agrees to provide security services for Confederation space. The euphemism was elegant in its simplicity. Humanity would become the galaxy's military force, the sword and shield of a civilization that had forgotten how to defend itself. And if we refuse? Cartwright asked, though he already knew the answer. Kilithara's patterns shifted to deep, resigned purples. Then the galaxy will live in fear of the day you decide you want something we have. And eventually, Ambassador, that fear will drive us to do something that will force you to respond. It was, Cartwright realized, the most honest diplomatic statement he had ever heard. The Confederation was offering humanity a place in galactic civilization, not out of altruism or enlightened philosophy, but out of pure rational terror. They had seen what humans could accomplish when threatened. They never wanted to see what humans could accomplish when ambitious. "I'll need to discuss this with my government," Cartwright said formally. "Of course," Kilthara replied. "Take all the time you need. We'll wait." As the alien delegation departed, Cartwright found himself alone with the weight of humanity's future pressing down on his shoulders. Outside the station's windows, the debris field from the battle continued its slow orbit around Earth, a reminder of what his species had accomplished in 7 minutes and 43 seconds of pure violence. Humanity had achieved in a single engagement what the greatest military minds in human history had only dreamed of: total victory against impossible odds. And the most terrifying part was how easy it had been. General Harrison's words echoed in his memory. "We're not just good at war because we had to be. We're good at war because we wanted to be." For the first time since the crisis began, David Cartwright allowed himself to smile. The galaxy had wanted to quarantine humanity because they were afraid of a species that enjoyed war. Now they were offering them a place as the ultimate arbiters of galactic peace. The irony was so perfect it could have been written by human hands. And perhaps, in a way, it had been. 6 months later, the first human Death World colonization ships launched towards systems that had been deemed too hostile for any other species to inhabit. Behind them, the construction yards of Earth worked around the clock to build the fleet that would protect a galaxy suddenly aware of its own vulnerability. Humanity had sought the stars looking for a place among civilized species. Instead, they had found their calling as the guardians of a peace they had never been invited to join. It was, Admiral Harrison observed during the first Confederation Defense Force graduation ceremony, the most human solution to an impossible problem that had ever been devised. They had turned their greatest weakness into the galaxy's greatest strength. And somewhere in the depths of space, on worlds too dangerous for anyone but humans to colonize, children played war games under alien suns, preparing for a future where their species would be known not as Earth's children but as the galaxy's sword. The age of humanity had begun not with exploration or discovery, but with 7 minutes and 43 seconds of perfect violence that had redefined the meaning of peace for an entire galaxy. And they had enjoyed every second of it.